This podcast is brought to you from the lands of the Turrbal people. We also acknowledge the custodians of the land that you're listening from. Before listening further, please be aware that this podcast deals with information, descriptions, and words relating to sexual violence. It's not suitable to listen to around children, and you may well find it causes distress. You might choose to listen to it somewhere where you're comfortable and you feel safe, or even listen with a support person. Reaching out for support is an extremely brave thing to do, and help is available. You can call the Sexual Assault Helpline on 1800 010 120 between 7:30 in the morning and 11:30 at night, 7 days a week. Or call Victim Connect on 1300 318 940, 24 hours a day. Both services have specialist counsellors who'll always listen and believe you. And you can remain anonymous if you like. I'm Kay McGrath. You might recognise my voice as I worked as a journalist in Queensland for many years. Through that role, I've had the privilege of meeting people like you, people who've experienced and survived trauma. Hearing your stories has inspired my work outside journalism, and it led me to get involved with the Daniel Morecambe Foundation and Act for Kids. I'm also a patron and co-founder of Protect All Children Today. I co-chaired the Queensland State Government Domestic and Family Violence Prevention Council that was established by Dame Quentin Bryce as a result of the Not Now, Not Ever report. And I'm also a founding member of Women in Media Queensland. This podcast has been developed by the Office of the Victims Commissioner in collaboration with many people who work with and advocate for victim survivors of sexual violence. Thank you to all of our contributors. This podcast has been recorded for victim survivors of sexual violence, family members or friends supporting them, or people who work with people who've experienced sexual violence. We often hear that for victims of crime, it's hard to find the right information at the right time. It's difficult to understand the processes which you may have to go through if somebody has hurt you. You'll have to meet and talk to people you've never met before. They'll use words that you may not have heard before. But I believe strongly that having information from somewhere you can trust will help you make decisions about what is best for you. Before we begin this episode, I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge that this is a difficult topic, but I want you to feel safe as you listen to this podcast. You can listen on your own. You can listen with someone you trust. You can listen at your own pace, all at once or in parts. And of course, you can listen as many times as you want to. I think it's important that we begin by acknowledging something bad has happened to you or is happening to you. There's nothing that I or any of the other contributors on this podcast can say to undo the hurt that's already been done. Please know the information included in this podcast is to help you seek help or report the violence. It won't take the place of professional support from experienced and qualified support workers or legal advice from lawyers. And let's acknowledge that you may feel nervous or scared. Dealing with the police and the courts can be scary and frustrating. I think it's important we understand the legal system in Queensland is built on processes, not on personal experience. It's important to remember that victims all have different experiences and stories, which can leave people feeling like no one understands their hurt or that no one is listening to them. Your experience of hurt may have been caused by someone you know, someone you've had or are still in a relationship with. You may not have even realised that you've been hurt until you shared your experience with someone else. You may have been very young and not understood what was happening to you. You may have blocked it out, tried to forget because remembering is just too painful. Your trauma may have led you to make decisions that you might not have made otherwise. You might have used drugs or alcohol to manage your feelings. Regardless, we hear you, and there is a network of support services who can help you. Today, we're talking about the rights that a person who's experienced sexual violence has after an offender has been sentenced. And I'm joined by Letitia from Queensland Corrective Services. Hi, Letitia.
Hello, Kay.
Thanks for joining us. First of all, tell us exactly what does Corrective Services do?
Queensland Corrective Services is responsible for managing adult correctional centres, which is what people often call prisons, and supporting the rehabilitation and supervision of adult offenders, both in custody as well as in the community.
And you actually work with the Victims Register team. Tell us, what's the Victims Register and what do you do?
The role of the Victims Register team is to support those on the register and give them information about important events that might happen during the sentence of the person that hurt them. That information can assist them to feel safe, understand where that prisoner is, and also to put strategies in place to continue to feel safe if that prisoner is released to parole.
So I was going to ask you, why it's important to keep victims safe, but obviously because it gives them an added sense of security, that person who hurt them, as you say, is in custody and that they know where they are.
That's right. The people are able to know where that person is and also what might be coming up as well if that person is in fact going to be released or being considered for release.
Corrective Services operates the Victims Register and we'll learn more about that. But let's talk about another body that we hear about, and that's the Parole Board of Queensland. What do they do?
Parole Board Queensland is an independent body. They're separate from Queensland Corrective Services. It's responsible for making evidence-based parole decisions for prisoners that have applied for parole. The Parole Board is made up of professional board members, public service representatives, Queensland Police representatives, as well as community board members.
Thanks, Letitia. Now, before we move on, I think, and you'll agree, it's important that we point out that we're talking here today about cases relating to adult victims of sexual violence who have been offended also by another adult. It's different information and there are different processes if the offender is under 18 years of age, is that right?
That's right.
And also if the offender has to be dealt with under the Mental Health Act. And in that case, a victim liaison officer, perhaps an investigating officer or support service that you've been working with will be able to tell you and explain if this applies to you. In previous episodes, Letitia, we've discussed the Charter of Victims' Rights, which applies through the criminal justice process. Can you talk to us about that as well?
Yes, Kay, absolutely. After an offender is sentenced, victims still have rights under the Charter of Victims' Rights. One of those, for example, is to receive certain information about an offender. Once an offender has been sentenced in court, the victim liaison officer or an investigating officer should be able to tell the victim the court outcome and give them some information about whether they can apply to be on the victims register. Then they can have a think about if they want to sign up to the register to receive some information against a prisoner. That's when a victim of sexual violence would possibly be in contact with the team that I work with at the Victims Register, either to ask questions or to sign up. This team will be the group that people will be in contact with during the offender's sentence.
So, as you're pointing out, victims, still have every right to information after an offender has been dealt with. Do people need to opt in to the Victims Register or does it happen automatically?
No, it's not automatic. You do need to apply to be on the Victims Register. It's something that doesn't happen automatically because it's important to us that a person has a choice whether to receive updates about the prisoner during their sentence. It's really common for victims of sexual violence to feel a range of emotions, including relief, anger or sadness, and an offender being sentenced may or may not bring them a sense of closure.
And how would you perhaps decide whether you opt in?
I think it's really important to be able to feel comfortable to talk to a friend, a family member or a support service about whether you might want to be on the Victims Register or not. And if you have any questions, certainly to contact my team and we can help.
They can
give you more information
and talk it through. That's good to know. So if a person has decided that they do want to sign up for the Victims Register, what sort of information would you provide to them?
The information that our team can give out can include what prison the offender is located in, if that offender escapes from prison or passes away, if that offender changes their legally registered name or alters their sex under a state law, if they're deported or removed from Australia. People registered will also be told the earliest date that an offender is able to be released to parole and whether or not the parole board's decided to grant the offender parole. If the offender is granted parole, can provide some additional information, including the actual date that that person will be released to parole, some details around the rules or conditions of that person's parole order, and also the general location that they will be based in the community.
So you're really giving them a sense of where this offender is and the conditions under which they're being held, when they may be released, and that would hopefully empower some people. But it's probably not everybody's choice, I'm guessing.
Yeah, victims of sexual violence may be unsure about whether they want to get this information about the offender. Some people will feel empowered or safer knowing that they'll get those updates, but others might be concerned that getting that information could increase their anxiety, make them feel worried, or even feel scared. If you do choose to register, you can choose to nominate another person to be given that information about the offender for you. That can be a family member, a friend, or a support person. Otherwise, also give our team a call at the Victims Register.
That sounds like a really sensible solution for some people, I'm sure, to have somebody you trust, you know, who can act as a bit of a buffer.
Yeah.
Because they'll be able to read if and when you need to hear certain bits of information. What about people, Letitia, who aren't registered? Is there any way that they can still get some information on the offender without going on the Victims Register?
Yeah, look, for those that choose not to be on the Victims Register, there is some publicly available information as to where a prisoner is in custody and which correctional centre that they may be in. This is available online at a Search for Prisoners link on the Corrections website. You just need the offender's name and their date of birth as well. This information's updated each day and can provide some peace of mind.
Yeah, that's good to know. But coming back to the Victims Register, which you can choose to opt into or not, tell me, is there a time limit where people need to sign up?
No, victims can contact the register at any time during the offender's sentence. There's certainly no time limit on when somebody needs to make that decision by. Also, if someone is registered and they change their mind and don't wish to receive that information anymore, they can either choose to be taken off the register or again nominate another person to receive that information on their behalf.
That's great to have that flexibility. Who can actually apply to be on the register?
If the offender has been sentenced to a term of imprisonment, people that are able to register are victims of the violent or sexual offence the offender is imprisoned for. Also, if your life or physical safety could be in danger because you are connected to that offence in some other way, or if you're in danger because the offender has a history of violence against you. Now, this could be generalised violence or it might be domestic and family violence. Where the victim has impaired capacity, their guardian is able to register as well. And where the victim's a child, their parent can register also.
Right. And does this apply only if you are living in Queensland?
No, definitely not. You can be on the Victims Register if you live interstate, if you live overseas, and also people that are in custody or might be on a supervision order with Corrective Services doesn't rule you out from being registered.
And if a prisoner contacts you or tries to contact you from jail, do you have to be on the Victims Register in order to ask for that to be stopped?
No, victims of sexual violence can request that a prisoner does not contact them from prison, and you certainly don't need to be on the Victims Register to do that. People are able to contact the correctional centre where the prisoner is located and ask to be removed from that contact list, or they can also contact the Victims Register team for advice.
Right. Okay, so a person has decided that they want to be on the register. How do they go about that, Letitia?
There are a few different ways to apply. There's an application form and an inquiry link on our website at corrections.qld.gov.au. And you can also contact the Victims Register team on 1800 098 098. The other option is to have a support service complete a referral to the Victims Register on your behalf. As part of that application process, victims will be told that any information that is given to them about the offender is confidential. They will need to sign a declaration agreeing that they won't share that information publicly, and that includes on social media or providing it to a news outlet or something similar.
But I would imagine there are situations where they can and they should share that information.
The registered victims can only share information with someone else if it is to get help or to be supported.
Mm.
An example might be telling a support service about the date an offender is going to be released from prison so that service can help them with some safety planning.
Yeah. And you mentioned before one of the things a victim will be notified about is if an offender applies for parole. Can we talk about parole? What exactly is that?
So when a person is sentenced to a term of imprisonment, the court will say how long that person has to stay in prison for before they can be released. If they are going to be released before the end of their sentence, they must follow certain rules and report to Queensland Corrective Services, and that's what we know as being on parole.
Mm.
It does really depend on the type of sentence that the offender is given. Sometimes they may have to apply to the parole board to be released on parole, and other times they'll be given a date by the court.
And as you say, I mean, that's dependent on each individual case, but in general, how soon can somebody who's in prison apply for parole?
As you say, because of that variation, it really does depend on the type of sentence, but a victim should certainly be told details of a sentence once the court matter has been finalised, and the Victims Register team can give them details of that sentence as well, including when an offender is eligible to apply for parole. Just because an offender is eligible to apply for parole, it doesn't necessarily mean they will make that application. In any case, registered victims will be informed when that person does apply for parole and also what the outcome of that application is.
And the decision whether or not to release an offender on parole, that's made by the Parole Board of Queensland.
That's right. The Parole Board decides whether the offender can be released on parole, and if so, what conditions or rules they have to follow if they are released.
So what sort of things do the Parole Board consider when they're looking at these applications?
The highest priority is always community safety and whether this person can be safely managed in the community should they be released to parole. Some things that help inform that decision are the offender's criminal history and their type of offending, psychological reports about the offender or reports of programs that they may have completed in custody, information about their behaviour whilst in prison, details of any domestic violence orders that they may be named in, and also what the sentencing judge or magistrate said in court when they were sentencing that person. Also, really importantly, the parole board will consider submissions from victims.
So victim submissions, is that an opportunity for a victim to actually be heard by members of the parole board if they are considering letting an offender out?
Absolutely. That's what the opportunity is about. It's about the ability for a victim's voice to be heard by the board. When our team contact a victim to tell them about the offender applying for parole, we'll discuss with a person the option that they have to make a submission to the parole board. This involves filling out a form, sending it back to us via email, and provides an opportunity for the victim to have a say. It's each person's choice if they want to make a submission or not.
And I would imagine it would be a very stressful time for a person to hear that an offender is likely to be released on parole. What sort of support is still available to them?
We know that it can be very stressful for some victims to hear that an offender has applied for parole. Usually victims are given 21 days to make their submission, but if someone needs more time to complete it, they can contact us and ask for more time. They're also eligible for support such as counselling, and our team can certainly give some details of support services or complete a referral for them.
And again, it's important to point out that it doesn't matter how long ago the sexual violence may have occurred. People can still reach out for that vital and very important support.
Definitely. It's really important that people know that it doesn't matter if that sexual violence was several years ago or only more recently. In the case of making a submission to the parole board, a victim of sexual violence might choose to talk to a family member, a friend or other trusted person or a support service to help decide if they'd like to make that submission.
Yeah, always good to talk it through. And Letitia, if a victim says, no, I'm not going to make a submission to the parole board, will they still be told about the outcome?
Certainly. The Victims Register team, we will let them know what the parole board decide. If a decision was made not to grant the offender parole, people will still be told the date the offender can next apply for parole again.
Right, so they're constantly kept updated. And so a person decides that they do want to make a submission to the parole board. What sort of detail would they share?
They might choose to tell the parole board about any fears they have for their safety. if the offender is in fact granted parole, and what they think might make them feel safer. So, for example, they might prefer that the offender not be allowed to contact them or not be allowed to visit certain areas. They also have the opportunity to share with the board what they think the offender might benefit from, such as types of counselling or programs.
And if a person does decide to make that submission, will their offender know that they've done that?
No, that information's certainly not shared. An offender isn't aware if they have a victim registered, and they're certainly not told if a victim has made a submission to the parole board. That submission's only read by our team at the Victims Register and the parole board members making a decision about that prisoner's parole application.
Good to know. Now, if an offender is granted parole, what sort of information will a victim be given?
Our team will provide some information about when the offender will be released to the community, the general area they will live in when that occurs, if the offender was given conditions on their parole order that the victim had asked for in their submission, and also any conditions on that parole order that might relate to the victim.
So what should a person do if they're still worried about their own personal safety after the offender's released on parole? They still have concerns.
Look, if anyone is worried about their safety after an offender is released on parole, there are lots of options available to people, and it's really important that they reach out to their support service or police about what options there are. Each case is so unique and individual, and the risks are so different for each person. So it's really important that they get that individualised response to make sure that they and their family are safe. But if they are in immediate danger, it's important that they call 000.
They should not hesitate. No. So moving forward, Letitia, an offender is now out on parole but breaks the parole order. What happens from here?
In that case, the parole board might decide to suspend the offender's parole order if they, for example, haven't followed the conditions of their order, if they've committed a further offence, or if they pose a serious risk of harm to someone else. When this happens, a warrant can be issued for the offender's arrest. Depending on what they did wrong, the offender could spend a short or a long amount of time in prison and will have to explain their behaviour to the parole board. In that case, people on the Victims Register will be told if an offender has had their parole suspended and if they are returned to custody. They'll also be told what the parole board decides and if and or when the offender will be released from prison again.
Okay, well, as we touched on before, I'm sure it must be so difficult for victims of sexual violence to hear that their offender is being released on parole or has completed their sentence. There must be so much emotion attached to that. You would see that.
Understandably, some people find this really difficult, and that's why it is really important that people know support is available, that there's no time limits on when they can speak to a support service about how they're feeling.
And just finally, Letitia, let's talk a little bit about a case where an offender is going to be kept in jail for longer than their sentence date. What are the circumstances around that?
There are a small number of offenders that are kept in prison or supervised in the community past the end of their sentence. That's because a court believes there's evidence that that offender will likely commit a serious sexual offence if they are in the community without supervision. These offenders are called DPSOAs. DPSOA stands for the Dangerous Prisoners Sexual Offenders Act. That's the name of the legislation relating to those offenders. If the person that hurt you has been looked at under this law, they might be ordered to stay in prison for longer or released to the community on a supervision order with some really strict rules. This is what we call a DPSOA order. If the court is thinking about putting the offender on a DPSOA order and you are registered as the victim of that sexual violence, you will be contacted by the Victims Register and given some more information and more details about how your voice can be heard.
So again, constantly informed about the offender. But it's also important that we should point out, Letitia, that this only applies to a small number of offenders, yes?
That's right. The DPSOA legislation is only a small group in the community.
Letitia, I've learned a lot today. Thank you very much. We've learned about Corrective Services Queensland that operate Queensland's prisons, their jails, but most importantly about the Victims Register, because it is a very powerful tool. This is something that people can choose to opt in or out of any time, yes?
That's right. That choice is something that's really important to us, that people know that the opportunity is there to be on the register, to receive information about that person or people that may have hurt them, and that they can choose to come off that register for a period of time if they no longer wish to receive that information.
And hopefully that gives a sense of power to people who've experienced sexual violence. But also you made the point that they may not choose to receive that information directly. They could nominate a friend or a family member who could basically filter that information and pass it on. So I think that's good to know. Is there anything else that you'd like to share with the listeners today?
I think I would just encourage anybody that has questions about whether they are eligible to be on the victims register, questions about what that experience might be like and what information they might be able to receive, to contact us. You can do that via that online inquiry form. Send us an email, give us a phone call. We'd love to be able to provide you with that information so that you can make an informed choice as to what you'd like to do. Or you might even seek for a support person to contact us on your behalf, whether that is that family member or friend or professional support that you have, and get that information that you need to make a decision. For us, it's really important that victims feel safe and that they have the information that they need to put strategies in place to stay feeling safe.
Yeah, most important. And of course, I'm sure they could do that anonymously as well. Letitia, thank you so much for coming in and sharing all your knowledge, and thank you for the work that you and your team are doing.
Thanks so much, Kay.
Thanks for listening. This was our final episode in this series, and we hope you found it informative. Listening to this podcast may have stirred up a number of feelings. Now is an ideal time to take a moment to see how you feel, and do remember support is available. You might want to check in with a trusted person, such as a friend or a family member, or you might want to call the Sexual Assault Helpline on 1800 010 120 to speak with one of their counsellors, or you might want to do both. You may have more questions that you want to put to a support worker. Thanks for listening, and please look after yourself and reach out for support if you need it.